Prison today, most of the prisoners today are younger. But many of these prisoners, and I think this is also different than prisoners today, many of these prisoners had developed a certain understanding and consciousness and a certain self-rehabilitation, that they realized that, yes, they had committed crime, and yes, they saw it was related to their economic status, but also they acknowledged that they would have to change themselves when they went back into the community. And therefore, you had a much more thoughtful, politically aware prisoner than you do today in many prisons. These were people that were very articulate, people who had read and studied their own history and the history of their people. And in that regard, they were very clear that there was nothing going to be gained by harming hostages or committing acts of violence. And when I say that Attica started out as a riot and turned into a rebellion, it was in that initial period, it was a riot. And their prisoners were running amok, and they could do anything to anybody. But when they elected that leadership was able to control the prison and make sure that the hostages were protected. And if you see some of the footage there's a very good video of Attica that was made, a documentary, and a lot of it has footage of the yard and footage of the prisoners speaking and negotiating and making statements. You'll see that they're very articulate, well-spoken, many of them, thoughtful, many of them. That's not to say that they didn't commit crime, but it certainly doesn't say that they were supposed to be shot down like animals as they were.
Let me help you with that, Michael, for a second. I'm a former federal prisoner, so let me say this. I found when I got out of federal prison and went to grad school, I was disappointed in grad school because I found grad school to be intellectually sort of lacking. In prison, in a penitentiary, you find sometimes exceptional people. There's something about being locked up with books and each other that some people actually spiritually grow. And to give you an example of that, if you think about, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or Victor Hugo or Solzhenitsyn or Gandhi or Martin Luther King, they're all prisoners. They all serve time in maximum security. So the idea that most Americans have that prisoners are somehow dangerous and somehow lacking in morality, I think is missing. Michael's, the way he characterizes Attica inmates as being thoughtful and organized is not surprising. In federal penitentiary, for example, I served time in the federal penitentiary where my cellmates were college professors and doctors and lawyers and politicians and labor leaders that were, half the prisoners in some federal penitentiaries are college graduates.
But Attica wasn't. Attica was mostly urban underclass people.
So, Michael, what I'm suggesting is they may be street people, underclass people, but when they get to a penitentiary and they lock them up for years at a time, it's not a whole lot different from being locked up in the university. I mean, there's books, you read books, you talk to each other, and some people grow.
That's right.
Michael, one last thing I want to say. What you said about medical care, in the federal prison system, there is no medical care within the prisons. They have medical facilities like Rochester or Springfield or Button or North Carolina. In the federal system, if you have a heart attack or you're diabetic, or if you get knifed in a federal penitentiary, you will die in that penitentiary because there are no medical care. Because they've got to bus you to a prison, to a hospital 500 miles away. And I'm just saying this because I remember the people. I remember seeing them die from heart attacks and from diabetes and from being given the wrong medication. I remember.
How is in your view, how society in general, also the law, how has that changed since 71 in regards to treatment of prisoners?
You know, it's interesting. I think that there's been some changes, but there's also a level of sophistication that makes being in prison even more repressive today than it was then. Of course, there are certain things that you have, let's say at Attica, that you didn't have then. That, for example, at Attica now they have conjugal visits for certain prisoners. Before at Attica, you couldn't even touch your loved one in the visiting room. You had to visit behind a screen where it was like this high, you sat down. But what's going on a lot in the prisons today is kind of a high-tech control. Isolation of prisoners. Prisoners spend a lot of time alone in their cells. You don't even have any interaction with a guard. A guard can feed you, open your cell, let you out on the gallery to walk up and down by pressing a button. And they're building more and more of these high-tech control unit prisons, which basically preclude prisoners from having any kind of contact with each other. See, at Attica, it was repressive, but you still met in the yard, and you still could have your classes, and you still could communicate with each other. Now what they're doing is cutting down on interaction between prisoners, making prisoners spend most of their time isolated in their cell as a way of controlling them. It's cleaner, and it may be a little more streamlined, but the effect of it is very sensory deprivating in terms of interaction or growth or any type of way that you can begin collective experience. I mean, the only thing you have is in a prison is be able to talk to somebody else or share stuff. And when you're isolated, then it makes it much more difficult. And that's the way they control prisoners now. And they're building special prisons all over this country, both state and federal. They call them control unit prisons. And they're basically where you're locked, isolated in your cell, and then you get out by yourself for a half hour to walk up and down a gallery. That's your exercise. And you have no contact with other prisoners. So it's, they learned from Attica that now they're going to, make sure that there's no kind of collective, development of prisoners and no kind of collective demands.
It's a video panopticon. If you can read a book called Birth to Prison by Michelle Foucault. It's a panopticon. They watch you with video cameras. The guards sit behind bulletproof glass with buttons, and they watch you on TV cameras. And it is sensory deprivation. And whole prisons are being built like that.
Just take some way, totally agree with your lawsuit, and I can't believe what they did. But don't you think that you're sort of supporting the riot? I mean, a little bit it says it's almost like supporting a spontaneous riot by seniors leadership, it's making it better. I mean, I don't agree with that. By saying to New York, by negotiating with them, don't you think that would give a green light to other prisons? I mean, I'm totally against what they did, but.
Well, Well, that was the philosophy of the state of New York. Yeah, if we continue to negotiate with these people, then other prisoners are going to, see the same thing. And Rockefeller said, if I come to Attica, then they're going to want me to come to another prison, and they're going to want me to go in, and et cetera, et cetera. But they were faced with a situation. We're dealing with human lives. And if you're faced with a situation of negotiating, even though it may down the line set a bad precedent, and going in and killing a lot of people, you got to think about saving the lives. Our lawsuit really isn't about whether they should have negotiated or not. Our lawsuit is about the way they went in and retook the prison and what they did afterwards. I think it's clear to me that they could have continued to negotiate. They could have shut off the water. They could have cut off the food. They could have done a lot of different things. And they had a thing at Talladega here, the federal prison, where these Cuban inmates didn't want to go back to Cuba, and they had taken some hostages. And what they did was, for 10 days they had a blackout, and you heard nothing about it, but they were negotiating. And then they went in with non-lethal weapons, some kind of contusion or concussion bomb or something, and they rescued all the hostages, and not one person was injured. Now, this is 20 years later. You could say, well, maybe the technology's better, but they could have done that there. The problem is that if you treat people in an inhumane way, if you don't give them basic human rights in prison, this is what's going to happen, because people will rebel. You cannot treat people that way, and they should have been able to respond to their demands before the riot, when they were doing them peaceably, and not wait till there was a riot. When there was a riot, they said, okay, we'll give you all these things you want. We'll give you better medical care. We'll take the pork out of the food. We'll give you books in the library in Spanish. They were willing to do that. But if they wouldn't have waited until these people got desperate, they might have been able to save lives. But my point is what they did afterwards. And that's the thing. If in fact they would have gone in and they would have beaten up some prisoners and put them in their cells and punished them, I wouldn't be here today talking to you about Attica, and no one would even be thinking about Attica. Attica would mean nothing. We're here today because of what they did after. And also the way they went in there and shot all those people. Attica means, in the lexicon of, people, a massacre. I mean, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Dog Day Afternoon, where Al Pacino is in a bank, and he's caught in the bank holding it up. And all of a sudden, all the New York police are outside. And it's kind of like a farcical situation, because they're going to come in and he's trying to stop. And he runs out and says, Attica, 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 to say, you're going to kill me, you're going to kill me. And so Attica will always mean that. And it will never, because what happened at Attica is unprecedented. It's never happened quite like that.
What happened to the bullets found in the bodies of the dead prisoners and hostages? Were they ever tied up to the guns of the personal weapons?
Yeah, the personal weapons they were, because they were able to show which correctional officers brought in their personal weapons. The bullets that the state police used, they couldn't tie up because they couldn't show what gun what state policeman had. And then, of course, 00 Buck shot, you can't trace. You only could trace the deer slug because it makes an impression as it comes out of the rifle. So they could have easily, and Malcolm Bell in his book says, they could have easily proven who shot what hostage or what prisoner. And what happened is that these the state police made up all these stories about why they did it. One said, I saw a prisoner coming at me with a spear, and I had to shoot him to stop him. Well, they have all this evidence from other people that were there, from photographs that were taken, that never happened. There's all these cases of them making up false justifications for why they fired their weapons. And they were able to prove that these were all lies. And that's all why Malcolm Bell finally quit, because he said he wasn't going to be part of this kind of cover-up.
My second question is, how is the law, are there laws on the books, aggressive laws, dealing with these type of things, that give prison inmates rights and everything, or is it just muddled with bureaucracy and that changes?
Well, prisoners have very few rights. There was a time when they had more, but the courts have really been cutting back on prisoners' rights. And at this point, prisoners have very few rights, but they certainly have a right not to be victimized by shot down in cold blood or beaten up unnecessarily or denied medical care. They have those rights. Those are constitutional rights. And you can enforce those constitutional rights under what's called the Civil Rights Act, which says that no governmental authority acting under state law or color of state law can violate the constitutional rights of a citizen, prisoners included. So if you're in your cell with a busted appendix and you're saying, I got to see a doctor, I'm going to die, and the guard comes by and says, oh, we're not going to give you medical care. That's too bad. I don't think we don't want to. That's a violation of a constitutional right. Or if he comes in your cell and beats you up. that's a violation of your constitutional right. But there aren't that many other rights you have as a prisoner. Very few rights you have as a prisoner. But these are ones that are protected by the Civil Rights Act.
Did the prisoners threaten to harm the hostages?
Well, what happened was the prisoners said, no. At one point, when they saw that they were getting ready to come in, massing and saying they were going to come in, several hostages were put up on the what they call the catwalk, with the prisoners behind them. And the idea was to say, if you come in, we're going to kill the hostages. They made that as a way to try and stop them from coming in. But when they came in, they never did harm the hostages. They could have killed every hostage before they were able to stop them. And not one hostage was killed as a result by a prisoner at that time. But they did put some hostages up there at the end saying, don't come in or we'll kill these hostages, as a desperate way to stop them from coming in, but it didn't work.
Do you think that what happened would be a lot different if it had stayed a riot rather than turning into a political rebellion?
Well, yeah, I think if it would have stayed a riot, I think there would have been a lot of racial stuff that went on. I think the hostages would have been harmed, and I think they would have gone in much sooner, and maybe with less loss of life. Maybe with less loss of life. Certainly, the assault force would have been less angry and frustrated and fatigued because they were waiting for 4 days to go in. And they had built up this whole anger and frustration that they just kind of released when they went in there. So if it would have stayed a riot, I think that may have been different. And also, I don't think it was as threatening as a riot. As a riot, it didn't threaten the fabric of the society, quote unquote, as a political rebellion did. So that's why I think it might have been different.
Do you know if the New York police or police anywhere in the country still use the dum-dum bullets that explode inside a body?
That's a good question. I would be very surprised if New York State Police still uses that. I mean, it would seem, totally strange to me, but I don't know whether they do or not. I mean, why, if they're using it against human beings, which bullets that are outlawed by the Geneva Convention, they would use such bullets. To give them credit, their explanation was if the bullet expands in the body, it has less of a chance to go through and hit somebody else. That was their explanation.
The other thing, the systematic beatings by police of prisoners that are in their custody is not unique to a riot situation. It happens all over the country in jails and prisons. And it seems to me that the reason it happens and that it can continue to happen within the community is because there's no outside review of police departments. In general, they have their own internal investigations in which they declare themselves of wrongdoing. They have a grand jury that can bring down indictments against all those prisoners, not one against a policeman. The whole system is rotten. What's the solution in the long run to that unaccountability of police for human rights violations in this country?
Well, I think there's a couple of steps. First, we got to get awareness and concern among the people on the outside. They have to somehow understand that the way we treat our prisoners is a reflection on our own society, and that we somehow have to be more concerned about prisoners. And it's hard because people who are victims of crime or see crime as a threat are very happy to get people put away in prison. But you go to prison for punishment, not to be punished. And we need to really raise the consciousness of that issue. And then the answer is we do need outside involvement. We need a way that there can be people outside that system reviewing claims of violations. Now, the courts play that role, but it's very limited. It's very hard because the courts have cut back. They don't want a lot of cases of prisoners in their courts. Prisoners have a hard time getting lawyers. And a lot of prisoners file pro se, I mean, on their own, and the courts don't want to be bothered with it. So we need some system other than going to court, federal court. We need some ombudsman system that allows people who are outside the system to review what goes on inside. Because as long as you have, you know, the fox guarding the chicken coop, you're just going to, you know, they're just going to cover up. It's just, you know, the code of silence. It's just something that happens in every police department in this country. You know, police protect their own. Guards protect their own. Probably lawyers protect their own. Doctors protect their own. It's not, you know, but the people who are police and guards, you know, they have this power that's much more formidable in terms of, you know, inflicting injury and death. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you for coming.